We're coming to the last few sessions of the day. It's been an interesting couple of days. As I try to attend most of the sessions, we started off by talking about the case for doing all these things, right? We talked about why this is so important, the perils of our own behaviors that's got us this far. And we've been talking about it for a long time, and yet we are not making enough progress, right? The 1.5 degree Celsius, I think we missed that boat. Now we're kind of talking about 2 degrees, and how do we accelerate some of our actions to kind of meet that number, right? And there are multilateral organizations trying to put together policies, and which, the NDCs, we're not making enough progress and all of that. But it is a bit scary, like I said yesterday. It is very scary. It's scary because people don't understand what's happening, right? We talked about the boiling frog in a syndrome, the mythical story of the boiling frog. And to make all these wholesale changes, right? We kind of group them into different things like energy transition that we spoke about, right? Which involves, the generation part of it, energy efficiency, grids, the previous session. Then there is clean mobility that we talk about, sustainable agriculture, waste management, so many things that come, steel and cement, which again is a huge problem, and how do we tackle that and so on. But again, all of this requires significant funding, right? It doesn't happen without funding. I think there are many startups here as well who would love to hear the story from people who do climate finance for a living, right? This is what they spend every day thinking about, worrying about. So I'm going to let them do most of the talking, but I want to set the context and say, let's talk about what does climate funding look like in India? What kind of funds do we need? And have go around the table or in the chairs and talk about what does your core focus look like, right? What kind of investment vehicles are you looking at? And some examples of what has worked for you, what not, in the first round. Then we'll come to specific questions. So let's start with Sandeep.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sandeep Hammer, and I'm the managing partner of Green Frontier Capital. We're actually a venture capital fund investing in early stage through climate innovation. And for us, the case for investing in early stage climate is very clear. I've always believed that the battle for climate change is going to be fought in India, and is going to be won or lost by India's green startups. And the reason for that is very simple. India is by far the largest and the fastest, largest growing economy in the world today. Third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. $4 trillion economy growing at least 6%. Next 2 decades will be a $16 trillion economy. So a 4x growth in the size of GDP, which would also mean the largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Now, climate itself is a very large opportunity, but India's piece is in the vicinity of about $100 billion for each year for the next 10 years. So massive. Massive requirement for funds. What's really interesting, and I'm going to try and answer that question for you in terms of how is the Indian financing ecosystem set up to address that challenge. And if you look at the journey of funding for any corporate entity, when it usually starts, the corporate entity basically is funded by the founder of the company, who bootstraps it, effectively accesses financing from family and friends at a conceptual stage. And then the next step is to effectively try and validate the science and the technology behind their business, at which point in time they actually go to a venture capitalist who's willing to take on that risk and give them a little bit of capital. And then when the product market fit is being established, you have a slightly later stage venture capitalist who actually comes in and provides capital. And when the product market fit is established, you have growth capital providers who scale the business. And when growth capital providers have scaled the business, the company is ready for an IPO. That entire process, effectively from start to finish, is essentially a 12-year process. India has a lot of capital, I believe, at the early stage, because the ticket sizes are small. So most startups actually who are validating science or technology behind their businesses need anywhere between $2 to $3 million, and that usually is followed up with another $3 or $4 million of investment. The late stage side of the capital is also where India has a decent amount of capital. The IPO markets here are developed. But where India really lacks capital is in the growth phase, and significant number of companies effectively fail in spite of actually creating a business model that works because there's simply no capital available in India. So as a VC, what we typically do is we come into the early stage of a company's life cycle. We actually provide them with capital to validate their science and technology. But through our co-investment networks that we create, we allow companies in India to access capital internationally where growth capital is available. And so that's what we do. We've actually invested in about 11 companies, several of whom have become category leaders. And we have several peer investors who are actually doing the same. So I'll allow them to kind of address this issue a little bit more.
Swapna?
Sure. So while Nat and Sandeep have given a good sense of what climate really we are trying to solve for, and it should have been solved for yesterday, I'll give you a sense of what we at Avaana are trying to achieve. And I think just to start by saying very few of us are actually fortunate to be in jobs where we get to learn so much and actually create the impact that we can hopefully see in next 10 to 20 years. So that's the purpose of existence in some sense. At Avaana Capital, we are an early stage technology fund. We're investing out of a corpus of 135 million. We've already made about 12 investments, some of them to be announced. For us, I'll define what climate means, and which may help seed some of the ideas here as to how to think about what to solve within climate maybe. So climate for us is basically into 4 or 5 key large buckets. So from energy transition to resource utilization to supply chains, mobility, sustainable consumption, agriculture. These are large GDP contributors, almost 70% between them, and 90% of India's emissions. So as we can think about anything meaningful which can be done in these sectors is going to have large needle-moving impact because these are large sectors by virtue of them. The second key piece is I think India is very unique. All of us are global citizens, talk to our global peers, and are seeing what's happening across the world. I think India has seen its first wave, which is mostly led by solar, second by green mobility. But I think the key piece really is India is at a junction where India is starting to create more and more technological innovations which can solve across other key areas. While process innovations will happen and are continuing to happen, product innovations are also starting to appear out of the country, out of research labs, incubators, accelerators, various folks coming together. So again, the second purpose is, can we find those breakthrough technologies similar to our global counterparts, which not only built for India, but for the world, because again, we are nifty as a geography, we know frugal innovation, we can really get it out and put it out there. So again, looking for those kind of opportunities within each of these sectors. Early stage investors, so come in really early, anywhere between 500K to 5 million. Are co-pilots in some sense, because first institutional check with the founder have already invested in 12 companies. 3 or 4 of them have already started scaling within these categories and creating the category in some sense. And again, the other big factor is not only building for India, but for the world. So that's how we see the whole climate landscape evolve, that we can actually build large companies over the next 10 to 20 years, which solve not only for India, but for the world. The third key parameter for us is, again, a very Southeast Asian, South Asia lens, which is, while the rest of the world can focus on mitigation because they're all developed economies. India, the prior presentation really showed us, right, that we can't wish away coal. We will have a lot of hybrids, we will have a lot of things, and we are developing as a country, which means climate will change. And to your point, 1.5, 2 degrees, God knows where we'll end up. But we know that the climate is changing, which means adaptation and resilience also become key important pieces of the puzzle. So that's how we look at every opportunity. Are they solving across this 3x3 matrix of mitigation, adaptation, resilience, sectors of importance, process, product innovation? Can we create large impact? And that's how we invest in.
Manshu, your take.
Great. Thank you, first of all, Nat. I think Swapna and Sandeep covered most of it, but a little bit about us first to start with. I represent Thea Ventures, early stage fund. Try to come at a stage where we start investing, maybe looking at something from 100K to 1 million. That's a stage which we are looking at. One key thing which is for us which is important is a lot of climate tech opportunities have a technological underwriting which has to be done before the business model innovation starts kicking in. This is where we spend a lot amount of time with our founders who we invest in. Started around 3 years back, like a journey of a lot of venture funds in that manner. Start operating from a single family office fund, invested in 10 companies so far across the sectors, which can be broadly divided into 3 major sectors out there. First one is energy mobility, where 75% of our portfolio lies, then alt material, which is at 20%, and then rest of the things are into the industrial decarbonization space. One thing I think which excites us the most about the climate tech as a thing is we see this as a very good opportunity. Specifically, one thing to note out there is that every geography have their own expertise. Like Singapore is a very good market when it comes to alt protein as a sector. Maybe at least we think in that manner, India market has to grow a lot over there. But if we see waste to value as a value chain or waste to energy, it's a very good space in India for that thing. So one aspect when we look out from a thesis standpoint is where does India has an advantage? And then comes the second point, which also Sandeep mentioned, that not all the more sort of the funding might be just coming from an Indian ecosystem. A lot of global funds or DFIs for that matter are looking at India as well. So how do we make sure that we make our portfolio companies ready for those kind of a milestone? So understanding those milestones and making sure that they get ready, because these technologies require money. And we don't have that much comparatively as a whole India, when I'm saying that we are seeing that compared to the developed economies that we can invest so much into technology and everything. So we have to be very frugal in that way, that what steps which you have to take to make sure that the companies reach the significant milestones so that they can become like an IPO ready or something of that sort in a 12 years of a time. Yeah.
Great. So I think I'll step back a little bit. I mean, we're going to talk about climate finance, but also take 30 seconds to talk about the finance aspect of it, right? So when we think about investments, we talk about grants, we talk about equity, we talk about debt. There is blended finance that's now seeing the light of the day. There's so much happening, right? So as you think about, from an investor, equity investors, I'm assuming all of you are equity investors primarily, they have an obligation towards their investors, right? LPs, right? So I'm also curious to understand, given climate is a very, to your point, Sandeep, 10, 12 years, right? It requires patient capital. You don't put money and get it back in 5 years, 7 years, like possibly other sectors, which also take longer time. But particularly when we think about climate finance and your obligations to LP, what are those conversations like? What are their return expectations? How do you kind of handle that discussion?
That's a great question. First of all, let me say that from a purely ecosystem perspective, blended finance, as well as early stage equity capital, grants, have been available, but catalytic capital has been missing significantly. And I think that basically the reason why catalytic capital has been missing is because the economics behind climate technologies simply don't exist. Fortunately, there are a few sectors in India where the economics are very, very obvious and they work. Electrical mobility is one of those areas. And therefore, it's no surprise that if you look at most of the portfolios of our portfolio and the portfolio of most venture capitalists, they're very electrical mobility heavy. However, if you look at some of the technologies that people talk about as in terms of being breakthrough, whether it's precision fermentation, whether it's sustainable agriculture, they require a lot of capex, they're long dated, and therefore people are not necessarily comfortable with investing that kind of capital in India, especially because there is no hedging mechanism also against the currency from abroad when they invest in India. I mean, if you actually speak to our LPs, the first question they ask you is, what's the return profile of these investments? Can we actually deploy large amounts of capital into this? What's the payback period? And how do I hedge my currency? Because I've actually lost a lot of money in the past investing in India just on currency depreciation. Therefore, when I actually pitch to them, I have to basically show them the vision for venture scale returns. If I'm not able to show them the vision for venture scale returns, it becomes very, very difficult to create the catalytic capital. Having said that, we have created a lot of catalytic capital. In our portfolio, we've invested about $25 million, like I said, across 11 companies as our first check writing activities. But we've been able to drive almost $500 to $550 million on the back of. So essentially, what I am trying to say is that catalytic capital does exist, but the unit economics of the businesses that you're actually investing in must make sense for those investors, because the macroeconomic factors that exist in India simply are not attractive to them. You have to actually show them that you can make 10 to 15 times their money and generate very high IRRs, and most importantly, provide exits on those investments. So I think the biggest issue that's been plaguing the venture capital and private equity industry is not even so much as deploying capital, finding the right ideas, but exiting those investments. Because you go out and talk to all these LPs and they're like, India's done great on paper, but when you actually have to exit an investment, get your capital back to our countries where we've invested from, it's been an absolute nightmare. So those issues need to be tackled before catalytic capital can be mobilized from abroad in a significant way.
Swapna?
I think, Nat, you make a very good point, right? As startups are responsible to us to generate returns, so are we responsible to our LPs to generate returns. I think we have tackled it in 2 or 3 ways. One is every time we underwrite capital for any company, we actually keep $2 aside. And that's a conversation we had with all our LPs as we were raising funds, that look, India Climate Tech is very early. We will see some great outcomes, but it has to be more patient. Now, patient is one from the time point of view. The second is actually availability of capital. And all of us are familiar with the term value of death, and especially given you're investing in climate, where you will see some product innovations which will need more capital than the others. Sometimes they might be at the right tipping point, but that capital is not available in the market. So how do we ensure that the companies go through that? Is where for every dollar we underwrite, we actually keep $2 aside. So very unique and something which we work with our LPs on. The second is, we also understand this part of that equity alone can't solve everything, and equity needs to be leveraged multiple times over. So as we underwrite these companies, we start a lot of them, engaging them in some of these grant, debt, and other conversations, which multiplies the money manifold over, and they are able to leverage the capital that we put in. Having also an institutional fund back them from climate point of view helps most of these companies to leverage that as well. I think the third key piece really for us is, as we invest in these companies, a lot of these are building for the world that exposure to the global audience. So as I think about actually 3 of our portfolio, which have actually raised follow-on funding, most of the capital has come from global investors in them. So again, while capital may not be available here locally, it will be available. I think it's just a matter of time. I think just having those conversations. And I would say the last bit is actually, while for us it's climate tech investing, as soon as these companies reach Series B, Series C, they are as good for any generalist investors as for any climate tech investors. So if we can show real commercial opportunities, they're viable for anybody. So those are the paths we take forward.
Yeah, you can add to it, Himanshu, but I'll add a question and you can address all of them as well. So one of the things we talk about from a consumer side of things is the whole idea of green premium, right? We can talk all about climate and all of this mitigation, adaptation, but consumer who pays says, I don't want to pay more for it, right? Particularly in a place like India, where the demographics are very different, you have a huge spectrum of people and their affordability in terms of what they could spend. So when you go at it, in terms of investing in companies, how important is it that they come up with a product that's not just not premium, but it's available for everybody, right? So that's one part. The second also is debt is typically available for companies that are profitable, right? You don't, equity comes first, being a high risk capital, and then debt. So back to Swapna's point about debt being available, typically in your portfolios, what stage of the companies are able to access debt capital in your field? You can start, Himanshu.
Can you?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, just one point to what Swapna also mentioned, that For us also, it becomes very important when we are raising the capital for the deployment, that the questions being asked on that which is the next sort of an investor going to come in. Climate is a very it's a very generic sector itself as well. It has multiple subsectors within it, right? So the question, if it's a hydrogen technology out there, is the next set of investor would be a deep tech investor. But if it's a very software led model initially, the next set of investor can be a generic investor, like what Swapna mentioned, right? Because the technology has taken place is more like a business innovation which is happening, so it becomes generic. So I think that thing, a visibility to an LP over there, so that they have an understanding that what an exit opportunity looks like, it plays a very important role when it comes to they being very assured that, okay, when we are investing in a climate tech fund at that point in time, we will see this kind of a future coming in. Now, to the part of the first on the question on, I think a lot of time, rather than green premium, we hear the word called green discount, honestly. That like the session which has happened just before that, which is on steel at this point in time. Like if they have to change the processes to go from an alkaline-based electrolyzers to an AEM or a PM kind of a technology, they have to change their internal infrastructure as well in that thing. So why would someone like a sector like would give a green premium on that thing? They were like, we are already changing it, give us some discount so that we can adopt it, right? So the question at the end of the day also to choose that what is the factor which is impacting that sector to adopt these kind of a technology. CCUS is one example in that manner. A lot of time we come across a situation that why are you not investing in a carbon capture utilization, point source capture? But the question there is the economics doesn't work at this point in time, because if you remove the carbon credit kind of a model in that equation. So the broader answer to that is that in few sectors it works, in few sectors still yet to develop, and we have seen that at least in a case happening in a textile manufacturing space. So the answer to that is, if you are selling your something to a consumer, and if the surplus at the consumer level is greater than your green premium, you will be able to do it. So that becomes simple down to that equation, that consumer has a potential to give it 200 rupees more, and your green premium is 100 rupees, then you'll be able to sell it across. Otherwise, you have to sell it at a discount to make sure that you are part of the value chain. Sorry, your last question was after that?
The debt.
Yeah, I think for the debt part of it, there are mechanisms, I'll say not just from a profitability standpoint, revenue-based financing, venture debt is available. For a few of our portfolio companies as well, they have availability to a venture debt kind of a model. Yes, a banking debt or an NBFC debt would come later on that point in time, but initially it's in a manufacturing business, it's a chicken and egg problem. If you not invest from your equity into a capex initially, you'll not be able to get to that volume, and if you'll not be able to get to that volume, your B2B client will not take you seriously and not deliver a big contract order for it. So the answer to that is, when you're using equity for your capex, you have to be very frugal about it and make sure that you underwrite that part, that you have used your equity money rightly into the capex, so that now once you are going for a bigger contract order which you have, there are people who are available to finance you on the basis of the contract or the purchase order which are available for you.
Now, just a couple of things that I wanted to add there. So I actually come from a public markets background, and I've pivoted to venture cap. And this entire concept of green premium, green discount has become very close to my heart. And I've actually noticed that India is a very, very unique place. So the concept of green premium typically exists in India specifically for international investors when the technologies that are actually emerging out of a specific industry are capable of replacing incumbent technologies in terms of both pricing as well as performance. So now if you actually introduce an amazing technology in India which addresses climate but is not priced correctly, you won't get a green premium. Or alternatively, if you actually come up with a product which is priced very appropriately for adoption, but is not better in performance terms than the incumbent products that they're trying to replace, you will not get a premium. That makes it that much more harder. So when coming back again to the question of steel and cement that we talked about recently, I don't know whether a private equity investor would be actually willing to pay a premium for either of those two technologies in India, because while they are superior technologies, they don't necessarily cost, they're not going to be easier or cheaper to basically produce. That's point number one. The second thing is, in addition to this, I've also seen that when it comes to climate investing, LPs are most specifically interested if the decarbonization impact of any technology can be measured, is visible. So it's not enough to say that I actually impact the environment positively. I need to be able to show a consistent growth in impact metrics in terms of providing those metrics on a regular basis and reporting them. But the way in which you actually do that is that you must basically be able to disrupt and do that through a digitization lens. So the 3Ds become very important when you actually look at any decarbonization technology. It has to decarbonize at scale, it has to use technology, and it actually has to be disruptive. If it's not disruptive and it meets the other two criterion, it won't work, it'll not fetch a green premium. If it's basically disruptive and it decarbonizes at scale, but it does not basically use digitization, it's probably going to be too expensive, it won't get a green premium. And the third point also makes sense, which is if it actually digitizes and it's disruptive, but it doesn't address decarbonization, it's not going to get a premium. So you need all 3Ds clicked. You need pricing and performance both to be addressed at the same time.
That's a good segue. I mean, Swapna, I'll start with you on the next one. As you guys do due diligence on some of these companies, they're very early stage companies. Some of them are really blue sky, blue ocean, whatever you call it, right? That involves a very, very deep tech component to it, and you don't know how it pans out, right? How does your risk models evolve, right? When you underwrite investments, when you choose them, and maybe some specific examples where you went in saying this has promise, I really don't know, my models don't match up, but there is a gut feeling that I want to go. We'd love to hear from all three of you.
Go first. So thankfully, VC is a job where you are paid to make mistakes, right? So that's a good thing. But as we think about it, moonshots, and every VC thinks about it from that point of view, that is this the moonshot which is actually going to return entire fund, right, in some sense. So for that, you will have to, and we have to invest in some of these breakthrough technologies. Now, breakthrough technologies, as we think about it, there are 3 or 4 market fits that we typically look at. It all starts from technology market fit, which is, while what you're selling is great, is it a Kool-Aid or is it not a Kool-Aid which actually can transpire, and then you start digging deeper, peeling. So we actually go to a roster of experts both globally and in India to understand and peel the technology. That's where we actually spend a lot of time diligencing if it's a breakthrough technology, right? The second is product market fit. It could be a great breakthrough technology, but to your point, if it is a first of a kind and doesn't end up being nth of a kind, then there's no point investing in that technology. It will always be a lab hobby project of some great scientist sitting out there, but doesn't help us, doesn't help the world, doesn't help the fund, right? So that's the second part. The third key piece for us is actually for this product market fit to actually become a large company, is there a team which can do? What we have seen often is there are great teams, but some of them are not commercially savvy enough to even take it out of the lab and make it real on the ground, right? While there is a product market fit, and if it was given to 2 great entrepreneurs who could do it, probably it would be a different outcome, right? Which is where you go typically to the founder or the jockey or the horse bet typically, right? So those are the 3 fits that we look at. And the fourth really is, I think gestation period is important, which means maybe this technology may have large outcomes in 10 to 20 years, but at the end of 7th, 8th year, do I really see an outcome for me as a VC fund? I think that's where we start looking at all of these parameters.
So how we mitigate risk is, of course, first of all, building diversified portfolios and taking bets on a lot of moonshot technologies, first of all. But more importantly, recognizing that when exits exist to be taken, you take them. The more exits you take, the more you de-risk people on their capital, the longer they'll allow you to sit on technologies that have binary outcomes. So I'll give you an example of one of the companies that we invested in. It's called Zero Cow Factory. It's a wacky idea, by the way. I'll just talk to you about it for a second. As you know, milk and dairy is a $1 trillion industry in India. and methane gas emissions are a big part of the dairy industry. Plus, there's a lot of loss of biodiversity. And to produce every 1 liter of milk, we expend 1,300 liters of water. So obviously, we need to decarbonize the dairy industry in a significant way. And so if there's a more responsible way of actually producing milk, then that obviously creates the opportunity to create venture scale returns. So we actually took a bet on this company, and what this company does is it's actually through science been able to kind of extract the DNA milk producing sequence of a cow, and then it's superimposed that DNA sequence on a microbe, and then subjected to that microbe to a bioreactor which actually has the same nutrition that a cow feeds on, to trick the microbe into thinking that it's a cow. So the microbe starts producing milk inside the bioreactor. It's incredible. So no cows are killed in the process. It's clean milk. And you can actually take that milk and produce all the byproducts of milk that you actually make with milk. One of the reasons why, by the way, why plant protein-based milk as a product category hasn't taken off is you can't make ghee and you can't make milk and you can't make cheese and you can't make butter out of it. And so there hasn't been a lot of support in the dairy industry for investing in that business as a potential hedge against the reduction in milk. So when we invested in this, we know that when it works, it's going to take a little bit of a long time to work because the cost of producing that milk is still much higher than the cost of consuming real milk. But when we actually had a couple of EV companies that gave us the opportunity to exit and return large part of our investor capital back early on in the journey, we took it even though we had the opportunity to make another 3 to 4 times our money on those, so that it allowed us to now sit through this entire journey of zero cow while it actually proves. So de-risking is actually also taking exits when they exist. I can actually talk about multiple companies recently that have been in the news in India where people started counting their chickens before they're hatched. $20 billion valuation, a lot of sovereign funds invested in some of those companies that were deemed as India's greatest startups, and they've gone to zero. So you don't have to actually sit as a VC and make 100 times money on something. In order to take the moonshots and sit with them on their journey, take your chips off the table when they exist on some of the ones that are much more nearer to you. So that's the way we do it.
To add that part, firstly, that's one thing I think it's very important to decide when to get out of something. That's because of the fundamental nature of the business in which we are in. A few things which helps us in underwriting the risk is one part which Swapna also mentioned. I think taking industries help because up to a certain extent, I think the investment team can go and understand what you're making at a technological level. But if it's a very moonshot bet, then you have to ask for the experts. And this is one of the example which we did it with our battery recycling company, because they have such a different process that we had to take an help from a steel manufacturing company to say that whether this technology can work or not. The second thing is which all the climate tech funds are also bounded by other than the revenue metrics out there is the carbon emissions total which they have to deliver within their fund cycle, with their portfolio companies are more sort of being able to reduce. So when we say any deal or when you're looking at things, we also have to map on that how much of a carbon emission this company gonna reduce in the cycle of a fund. That's the thing. The third part is very clear on that thing, that whether this company will grow on a revenue-based milestones or whether on a technology-based milestones. So if a company, maybe for an example, for the next 5 years, like we have a company in a flying taxi space, right, in our portfolio. We know that for the 2029, they might not make any revenue as a whole. But what are the clear milestones they have to achieve over a year and so that they attract the next sort of investment. So initially, the founding team being very clear in the approach and say that these are the milestones which we have to achieve, at least for the next 2 years and at least for the runway of which we are raising. And then the last part is a lot of founders make a mistake that, at least in climate tech, which I have seen, is they are spending that a lot of their time just on the technology and not from the day zero understanding that how I can make from lab to FOAK to the NFFO, this thing. So I think that strategy being very clear at the start of the, when we are looking at the investment, that becomes very important. And I think the last part is gut feeling definitely has to be there. The team understanding that sector becomes important.
Okay, so I know we have folks from IIT Madras here, and we have the best of technology minds. So if you're looking for investments, if you're looking for solutions that that you want to invest, what kinds of things you're finding a challenge? You're not finding enough great ideas, great solution, either certain sectors or certain kind of solutions and sectors. What would that look like so that they can come back with ideas?
I think for us, we're now a fairly large fund. So you must understand that when we make investments, the real value add is not capital and necessarily intellectual talent, because I think that's getting more and more commoditized. Every fund now has principals or managing partners who've gone to Wharton or Harvard or Cornell or Yale or LBS. Capital obviously has become very, very commoditized. So the question is, what more can you do for a company when they come to you? And so you're limited by the amount of time and energy that you can expend on a company, which means that I have to spend more time with lesser companies than actually spend lesser time with more companies, right? So when you run a large fund, the biggest challenge is where do you find ideas where you can actually deploy large amounts of capital, because the ideas are truly scalable, on the back of potentially strong product market fits. So the challenge for us is basically finding those companies. We've looked at 357 companies last year and invested in 4. It's harder to get into Harvard University than it is to get into a Green Frontier portfolio company. So my question is that, obviously, where do I find those companies which I can scale capital at? And it's even perversely even more challenging because as those companies effectively grow, you have to put in more and more capital.
Yeah.
That's the biggest challenge for me right now, is to find those companies.
I know we're out of time, so maybe last 30-second response from both of you for that.
I think for me, what really will help move the needle forward, right? As I think about a lot has been done on solar and mobility. Our portfolio actually has only 1 or 2 solar and mobility companies. Rest of all is more towards the newer technologies. I think we do see that as India is growing and GDP is growing, waste will become a crucial part of the puzzle that needs solving, be it solar panels, be it batteries, be it everything else, right? With the consumption economy growing. So would love to see some excellent ideas around how are you really tackling with circular economy.
Thank you.
The sector which we are also very excited at this point in time is alt materials as a whole, low carbon materials. So that's something which we are also very excited about. And the industrial decarbonization, the few of the things coming out there, digital twin and these sort of technologies for the process optimization. I think one thing which at a fund which we like a lot and would always suggest and founders to, that ask your investors also as many questions as possible why they want to invest into that sector. Because if the thesis matches for both the parties out there, that's a very good stage to be in, because then they also know that how this company will grow, and you also know that how I look to grow in company. And you cannot just say that out of these 3 to 4 models out there, some one thing would work out, because you know from the day one how you have to go from A point to B point to the C point.
Sure.
Yeah.
I do think we're out of time. So thank you for a brilliant perspectives. I think you all do this day in, day out. So thank you. Appreciate your insights, and there's a lot more we'll talk in the days to come.
Thank you all. That was a wonderful session.